Our second idealist is George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, or GWF Hegel. Right? Hegel's version of idealism stems from, you have to understand the tradition in which Hegel's thinking occurs. Hegel's idealism is inspired by being a absolute fanboy of Kant and reading Kant's own metaphysics and epistemology in the Critique of Pure Reason under that idealist tradition that I said was very, very popular originally. Right? Now, Hegel thought that Kant got a couple of things wrong, such as the postulation of a separate world, right? That cannot be known, right? A fundamentally real world, right? Separate from anything that the mind can understand. And he said that this idea of Kant's, that there is a noumenal world, is akin to saying that matches light because fairies dance atop the head of matchsticks and are and spontaneously combust when those matchsticks are struck. Right? It's unprovable. The idea being, it's unprovable. So why bother even postulating something like that? It's philosophically unsound, Hegel says. And this is what led to Hegel's version of idealism, which is a form known as absolute idealism. Hegel's own philosophy being a form of what's called absolutism, which is the idea that everything is a process of constant becoming, right? Creation, if you will. And there is no stable universe, right? Going way, way, way back to, I believe it was the second week of the course, we talked about, broadly speaking, substance metaphysics and non-substance metaphysics, or metaphysical theories of being on substance metaphysics, and metaphysical theories of becoming, non-substance metaphysics, right? And non-substance metaphysics, metaphysical theories of becoming state that this principle of change is the most fundamental, right? And I mentioned that Heraclitus was the odd man out amongst not just the pre-Socratic philosophers, but most Western philosophy for a long, long time. And Hegel is where we see the first really robust theory of becoming, again, in Western philosophy, specifically like European traditions. Right? So for Hegel, everything is a product of the mind's process. Right? It's constant unfolding, if you will. Now, to give you a picture, Hegel's philosophy divides into kind of three branches, or is composed of kind of three main elements, right? For this to describe this process of constant becoming. You have thesis on the one hand, right? One point, which is just anything. And then on the other hand, you have antithesis, right? Which is that thing's opposite. Now, between these two, stemming from the interplay of these two, you have synthesis, which is going to be the greater whole that comes from the reconciliation of the two concepts with each other, right? Basically, an interplay of thesis and antithesis. Right? So what you get is something like a triangle. Right? Thesis up here, antithesis down here, and then synthesis over here. Now, Hegel says that for each thesis, its antithesis contains an element of that thesis, and vice versa. Right? But for Hegel, opposites are not purely contradictory. They are contrary, but they contain elements of each other within themselves. Right? And it's only when those elements of each other are reconciled within them that we come to the greater understanding that is the synthesis. And this is the mind's own unfolding along the lines of these concepts. Right? So to give you an example of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, there is what is called, in his classic example is called the master-slave dialectic. Right? And the idea is, now, you don't need to agree with these concepts. I'm not endorsing this understanding of masterhood and slavery, but this is how he puts it, right? So you can get an element of it, or you can get the essence of it, right? Um, so in this dialectic, he uses the master and the slave as the two poles for thesis and antithesis. Right? So the master is master to the slave, right? Um, and the slave is slave of the master. Right? And on the surface, it appears, according to Hegel, that the master has all the power. Right? The master is the one who is free. He has power and no responsibility. No. He's not beholden to anyone, right? But in being the master, he also is responsible for the slave, right? He needs to, if he wants the slave to live, take care of the slave, right? Feed the slave, clothe the slave, provide for the slave, make sure the slave doesn't overwork themselves, which means that he is, in fact, responsible. That he is not perfectly free. He is bound. Uh, he exists in bondage to the slave, his responsibilities to the slave, and he is, you know, powerless to this. Right? He's powerless to his role. The slave, meanwhile, appears to be the direct opposite. Right? Bound, full, burdened with responsibilities, and so on and so forth. Right? But when you look at it, well, slave does not need to seek out his own he does not need to seek out his own desires and wills, and this is what makes him, in fact, free, right? All of his responsibilities are given to him, right? There's no need to suffer searching for meaning. Again, this is Hegel's own understanding of it, and it's just an example. We'll go to a far less contentious one after this, right? So he's free from having to determine his own responsibilities. He's actually in his labor to to the master. He finds freedom. He has a complete lack of responsibilities, and he has power over the master. Right? So long as the master needs the slave, right? And so he is the master's master. And this is again Hegel's argument. And so from this idea of bondage, we see that freedom is this idea of bondage and freedom is really an interplay between the two. Right? So to go to a less contentious example, right, and less vivid also, this is how this works for consciousness, right? For consciousness. So consciousness, the mind exists, and so does the world. Uh, but consciousness, in order for it to, know the world, must pervade the world, right? The mind just existing, perceiving, and thinking, and doing all that it does, separate from, objects of knowledge, right? something there to know is just kind of standing alone, oscillating, doing nothing in particular, right? It's only when it feeds into the world and grasps at the world that it actually knows anything. And similarly, the world can't be fully inert, right? And just in place in the way that Descartes talks about it. Not according to Hegel, at least. Right? The world must be at least somewhat active. Right? It has to be steady and stable, but there has to be an element of the mind in there too, right? Because otherwise, how does it pervade the mind in turn? Right? They can't be completely distinct things, right? That there has to be some element of the opposite in each other for them to come to know each other, right? Uh, and it's so the world must similarly be active. It can't just be inert, stable, in the way that Descartes describes the body of being, and the mind must have some level of stability, right? It must have some element of the world within it. So the world must be held within the mind. And in as much as the world pervades the mind must also in turn pervade the world. And it's only when these two start mutually grasping at each other that you get self-consciousness at the point of tension between the two. Right? If they're not pressing up against each other, pervading each other, and grasping each other, then they'd just be separate. Right? That point of tension, that line of tension between your two hands when you grasp them together, that's what self-consciousness is. That's what synthesis is. Right? And same thing too with being and not being. Right? Being is characterized by existence. Non-being is characterized by non-existence. Right? So for something to be in a particular way, to exist in a particular way, is for it to have certain qualities and also simultaneously to lack other qualities. And for something to not exist, right, is for it to lack certain qualities, but at the same time, it must have certain qualities in order for it to lack others. Right? So you see that for something to exist at all, it must go through change. Right? For something, right, if you grow up, right, just think about a glass of water, right? Having a glass of water. Right? You fill the empty glass, and then you take a sip. What have you done? You've changed the volume of it. Right? You've changed the state of the glass from empty to full, a little less full. Right? What all is involved in this change? Well, for one, you had to take a state of non-being, right, fullness for the empty glass, and change it to something that it was, full of a liquid, filled with water. And at the same time that you did that, you took its pre-existing state of empty, right, and deprived it of that emptiness. Right? And this is the sense in which, being leads to becoming the greater synthesis, the more robust reality.